Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Metcalf, and I'm the Managing Director here at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. We are very pleased to be hosting this conversation today on converting commercial lands to residential uses. It is a timely topic. Many factors, including the transition from brick and mortar to e-commerce, the growth of remote work, the dire lack of affordable homes in high-cost places, as well as the after effects of COVID, have all made policymakers, advocates, planners, and developers looking increasingly to commercial lands as a potential tool to solve our housing crisis. The Terner Center recently put out 2 reports aimed to answer these key questions about this strategy. The first study we released looks at the number of conversions in California that happened between 2014 to 2019 and offers a model for predicting the future of conversions under status quo conditions. The second paper investigated the conditions that make adaptive reuse of an existing commercial building, as opposed to demolition, the preferred outcome. Today, we're really looking forward to reflecting on this research and assessing how our commercial lands can play a key role in solving the state's housing crisis. Before we jump in, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, we're pleased that this conversation is co-presented with the American Planning Association Housing Community Development Division and is available for course credit. Second, we will be taking questions today from all of you on the webinar, and I encourage you to use the Q&A feature. You can go ahead and drop your questions into our presenters and panelists, and we'll spend some time at the end of the panel answering audience questions. These research projects were funded by the state's Department of Real Estate. We're very grateful to the support of Commissioner McCauley and his fantastic team. And I will shortly be handing over for introductory remarks to Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramirez, who, as Secretary of California's Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, oversees the Department of Real Estate and has herself been a true champion for state investment and engagement in housing, and has led the team in Sacramento through amazing challenges during the past couple years of her service. And of course, she brings great insight into the federal landscape from her time in the Obama administration running HUD's public housing portfolio. Before we bring her in, we'll actually show a short video of a trip that she, Commissioner McCauley, and others did to an adaptive reuse building in Sacramento earlier this month.
A tour for Commissioner Doug McCauley and Business and Consumer Services Agency Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramirez. The two and a group of others got a tour of the Warehouse Artist Lofts, a unique adaptive reuse project in the historic R Street district in downtown Sacramento. The tour took place on November 1st. Part of the WAL is the historic Lawrence Warehouse, built in 1914 and listed on the National Register. The tour coincided with the release of 2 studies funded by DRE and conducted by the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. One of those studies focused on adaptive reuse, which is the taking of commercial structures and turning them into residential housing.
Adaptive reuse is such a powerful model to generate much needed housing. When you really think about where we are today with the demise of brick and mortar, there are just tremendous opportunities to generate housing out of offices, retail, banking, etc. And when you really think about it, we recycle bottles. Why are we not recycling more buildings? It's just a tremendous opportunity for us to move forward and generate housing.
Buildings take on different forms and uses over time. Some buildings, like this, which used to be a warehouse, became obsolete at some point. But there's no reason for why that building should just remain obsolete. This is a great demonstration of how you can take an old building and convert it into a new use, and specifically convert it into a new use that is really important for us at the state level. And that's about creating more housing and creating more affordable housing and a sense of community for people of all sort of income spectrums to be able to thrive.
The WAL is a mixed-use, mixed-income community for artists. The tour was an opportunity for the Secretary and Commissioner to get a look at real-world results of an adaptive reuse program.
All right, well, thank you, Ben. Do you want me to go right in or? Okay. Ben, thank you so much to you and to the Terner Center for the invitation to be part of this. Thank you for sharing the video of my recent visit along with Commissioner McCauley. to the warehouse artist Lofts in Sacramento. I was so glad to tour this mixed income, mixed use community and really to see firsthand a successful large scale commercial to residential adaptive reuse project. The uniqueness of this building was not only in its architectural characteristics and design, but also in its residents. And so I had an opportunity to visit with several residents and the property manager. The warehouse artist Lofts provides not only an affordable place to live to working artists, but it also is inclusive. There's market rate and affordable housing units. And once a month, WAL, also of course short for the Warehouse Artist Lofts in Sacramento, once a month, WAL opens its doors to the public to showcase the work and talent of this artist community, providing a unique shopping experience. And I know that because I had an opportunity to attend this month's First Friday event. I was so impressed by the transformation of the space into a public market. Artists were there displaying their craft with pride and joy and shared their stories with buyers, including myself. I did get a chance to buy a few items. So the connections and sense of community was just very uplifting and inspiring. And today you'll have an opportunity to hear from one of the residents, Diana Jahns, about what makes this housing community a special place. So as Ben mentioned, tackling the state's housing affordability challenges for us under this administration, we're laser focused on this, and we know that it's going to require new strategies, new approaches and tools and innovation. But it's clear to me, especially after reading these reports produced by Terner Center, that commercial to residential conversions can be part of our overall housing strategy. But we also recognize, of course, that there are some barriers that need to be overcome. As Secretary of the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, I'm working very closely with Governor Newsom and this administration and our various housing entities to coordinate a unified set of housing strategies across the full continuum, ranging from our efforts to prevent and end homelessness, to expanding affordable rental housing and homeownership opportunities, all the while keeping a focus on equity and opportunity for Californians. Over the last 20 months, we've been working in earnest to protect Californians, particularly those that have been the most vulnerable to the destabilizing forces of this pandemic. This collective effort has brought us closer together on issues that require new solutions and new approaches. And it is time to continue to move the needle on these stubborn challenges that we face when it comes to housing, including, of course, addressing the disproportionate impact that housing insecurity has on low-income communities and communities of color. And so, thanks to Governor Newsom and this legislature, this year's budget has a historic allocation of housing and homelessness investments. California is deploying $10 billion to accelerate housing production and also to do everything possible to preserve housing affordability. And we're also deploying $12 billion to tackle homelessness. These massive investments are not possible without the continued partnership of the legislature and our federal partners. And together we're making sure that these historic resources help as many Californians as possible. And we're also answering the governor's call when it comes to ensuring that no one gets left behind, and that as we come out of this pandemic, that we come out more resilient and driving bold policies and programs forward. That is why this brief and the research conducted by the Terner Center on commercial to residential conversions, and of course, with funding from the California Department of Real Estate is very important to us. During my tour of WAL, I had an opportunity to meet the architect, Michael Malinowski, and he explained that data and sharing best practices and really creating the opportunity to bring forward new knowledge and a new sense of courage is important if we're going to address these issues across the state. So it's this new knowledge and this courage that will help developers, architects, policymakers, and people implementing. This is what we will need to reimagine the possibilities and to overcome the challenges that we face as a state when it comes to housing affordability. Our overall plan to expand housing is not reliant on one single approach, but on a set of strategies that will help us move the needle. Strategies like home key and the use of accessory dwelling units. I think hopefully many of you know that home key, which now has become a national model, was designed to convert hotels and motels into housing for individuals experiencing homelessness. This was a successful part of this administration's response to this pandemic because we were able to leverage and recognize and move together with a sense of urgency, removing barriers to the building process and creating units to provide safe housing for individuals experiencing homelessness. While this program generally converted hotels and motels into deeply affordable housing, about 20% of the projects were other types of commercial buildings, including underutilized office and retail properties. Building on the home key model, we want to leverage other building types to reinvigorate existing spaces, also to improve infrastructure and build the housing stock to create homes for more people who need them. Which brings me to why I'm optimistic and why I very much appreciate this gathering today. It is important for us to understand the opportunities and the challenges when it comes to adaptive reuse, understand the opportunity as it relates to the overall effort, but also understand that we do need to address code challenges. We do need to understand what level of technical assistance needs to be provided to locals to be able to use this strategy as a mechanism for addressing housing affordability. Currently, we are deploying a new program that is tied to the accessory dwelling units priority that we have as a state. Over the past few years, since the Department of Housing and Community Development made changes to the code enabling the creation of more ADUs, we have seen an increase, a spike in the ability to be able to use the ADU program as a way of addressing housing affordability. And so I'm hopeful that as we take the same approach, the approach with home key and the approach with ADUs, providing technical assistance, addressing code changes, and also providing additional funding to support these efforts, that with intention and speed, we will be able to also address the barriers that are in the way of adaptive reuse and make this part of our overall strategy. So I thank the Terner Center very much for pulling us together, for the continued partnership, and for bringing awareness to the possibilities as we move forward to ensure that all Californians have a dignified, affordable, and safe place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for your thoughts this morning and for your ongoing leadership on these really important topics in Sacramento. Next up, I want to introduce Issy Roman. Issy is the founder of MetroSite and a long-time Terner Center affiliate and fellow. He's also the lead author of our report on commercial zoning, strip malls to homes, and he will now take a few minutes to walk us through several of the key findings that emerged from this study. Issy.
Thank you, Ben, for introducing me. Let me get my slides up and we will get going. So the goal of this study was to size up the current contribution of commercial commercial lands being converted to residential in producing housing in California, to get a sense of where they happen and to get a sense of, what kind of role they can play in California's housing strategy going forward. To give some context, California, and especially California's coastal metros, need a lot more housing. Building more densely in residential areas is very much an uphill battle. And the conversion of commercial lands to residential use might be a good alternative. It might be the easiest route to find land to produce more housing and do it densely. And that was true in 2019 before the pandemic. Now that the pandemic has come about, some existing trends that were already underway are supercharged. And what I mean by that is the shift from brick and mortar retail to e-commerce, which on one hand frees up a lot of commercial land that's being used for retail right now. At the same time, it also adds requirements in terms of industrial space, but it does potentially create good opportunities for reusing commercial land for residential use. Thanks to the pandemic, we also have a lot more work that is done remotely and that might stay that way for the long haul. And that kind of puts under question what the future of office space is and whether there are opportunities to convert office space to residential use. All in all, it seems like a good moment for repurposing commercial land for residential use, more so than in past periods. So what can we tell you about commercial lands? First of all, where are they? And the answer is they are everywhere in every community. They're distributed in poor areas, in wealthy areas, close to the heart of the metro, far in the periphery. They're ubiquitous. That said, if we zoom in more closely to the neighborhood level, they're not everywhere. They're concentrated along thoroughfares. In this map on the right, you can see West LA, and you can make out the main thoroughfares thanks to where the commercial land is, even if the thoroughfares weren't marked on their own. They're also concentrated in clusters in some areas. On the left, you've got a map of Silicon Valley, the stretch from San Jose to Mountain View, and you can definitely see in blue clusters of office space. And in LA, you can see clusters near LAX. And of course, downtown is a big cluster. So commercial space is everywhere, but it's concentrated in certain types of streets and certain clusters. What have we learned from this most recent study? In this recent study, we looked at 2 points in time. We looked at 2014 and 2019 and asked where between those 2 points in time have commercial parcels converted to being residential. And we did some work to estimate how much housing was built on them. The bottom line, if we think of Southern California first, is that the greater Los Angeles area, 5 counties, including the Inland Empire, produced about 200,000 net new housing units over that period. Of those, about 28,000 we estimate came from converted commercial lands. That's a lot, but that is still a small share of the total. That said, if we look at LA County specifically, they're closer to a third, 30.6% of the total net new homes came from the conversion of commercial lands. And that speaks to a couple things. One is that there are fewer opportunities for greenfield development that produces a lot of the metro's housing in LA County specifically. It's denser, it's closer to the core, and it tends to involve redevelopment more than development per se. The other is that the city of LA and some cities around it are more permissive in terms of their existing allowance to build residential, to conduct residential development on commercial parcels. Many places don't allow that. LA specifically does. And that is probably one of the reasons why the share of housing produced there coming from commercial lands is higher. The shares are much lower when you look at Orange County and almost negligible when you look at the Inland Empire. Here we're showing the number for Riverside. San Bernardino is similar. In the Bay Area, you're stuck around the 10% of new homes coming from commercial redevelopment. That's true in San Francisco itself. It's also true in the South Bay, around San Jose and in the rest of Santa Clara County. It's also true in the East Bay and Alameda County, and the number is similar for Contra Costa. Marin stands out as having virtually no units coming from redevelopment of commercial lands. We counted 8 in our estimates. The conversion of commercial lands to residential use is clustered closer to the metropolitan center. The charts you see here show you LA and San Jose on the left, and each bar represents a different ring as you go from the center outwards. The rate of conversion was definitely higher closer to the center. The amount of land converted is somewhat more skewed to the periphery where lots are larger, but that's more than made up for by greater densities of development in the center. So if we were to plot the share of units by ring, you'd see them even more skewed towards the center than this conversion rate that we're showing in these charts. Conversions are more likely to happen in older buildings or on commercial parcels that don't actually have structures like parking lots. And that is true pretty much everywhere and sits well with common sense. If we found something else, we'd be worried. Going forward, we modeled what is likely to get built on commercial lands over the next 5-year period. And it's pretty similar to what was built. And that's by design. We're looking at an as-is scenario where legislation is not changed. How much is that? Is that enough? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Well, it turns out that if we use the RHNA allocations for the LA metro area and for the San Francisco metro area as our benchmarks, commercial lands produce about 4% of the RHNA allocation. Whether the RHNA allocation itself is enough is a separate question, but assuming it is, 4% is what we can get from commercial lands. That means that even in the most aggressive scenario where new legislation is introduced that makes it very easy to convert commercial lands, even if that kind of legislation were to double or triple or quintuple the amount of housing produced on commercial lands, we would still need a lot of housing to be produced off of commercial lands. 4% is essentially 1/25 of the RHNA allocation. So unless you can increase the amount of housing produced 25-fold, which sounds fantastic or fantastical, we're going to need to produce housing off of commercial lands as well, which means this can be an important part of a total housing strategy. It can't be an entire or the entire housing strategy. To start wrapping things up, some policy suggestions and recommendations from us. The first is that a lot of jurisdictions need help figuring out how to reform the ability to convert commercial land to residential. So there's definitely room for technical support from the state to those smaller jurisdictions. There's also room to reward better treatment of commercial to residential conversion in pro-housing designation programs. And third, last but definitely not least, there's a lot of ambiguity and lack of clarity around what is allowed. Just trying to figure out which jurisdictions allow commercial lands to have residential uses on them or not, when and where and how much, reveal to us exactly how murky current rules are. And we think that there's room for some statewide standard that makes things simpler and more obvious. So that's our main recommendation. Overall, what we learned from the study is what I said a moment ago, which is converting commercial lands to residential use is a promising way of providing new housing, and it can provide a meaningful amount of new housing, especially if we think of LA's 30% of current housing coming from this type of conversion. That said, it's unlikely to be able to provide enough. Someone who argues that all of California's housing needs can be addressed through this kind of corridor development is probably being overly optimistic, and there is still a great need for additional strategies addressing residentially zoned areas. I'd add a word of caution to that, and that is because of where commercial land is concentrated, if we were to go the route of only producing housing on these commercial corridors, we would run the risk of ending up with kind of a two-class society reflected in housing, where a shrinking minority of the most affluent live in single family areas or in low density residential areas, and a growing majority of people live in these commercial districts along these commercial corridors in much denser housing. So my personal take is we can't let this be the only strategy. It has to be part of a broader set of strategies. And with that, I'll let the rest of the conversation continue.
Thank you very much, Issy. That was very helpful. We'll turn now to our panel for their thoughts and reactions. We have 4 panelists with us today. I want to start first by introducing Elliot Kwon. Elliot is a graduate student researcher here at the Terner Center and currently pursuing architecture and city planning degrees at UC Berkeley. And he was the co-author of our paper on adaptive reuse challenges and opportunities in California. Next up, I will welcome Tom Pace. Tom is the Director of Community Development for the City of Sacramento. He directed the Sacramento 2035 General Plan Update, the new Planning and Development Code and Mixed Income Housing Ordinance for the city. And Andrew Cussen. Andrew is the Senior Manager of Investments for Regency Centers. Prior to joining Regency, he was Development Manager with Rad Urban. I'm also very pleased to have Diana Jahns. Diana is a photographer and artist based in Sacramento and is a current resident of the warehouse artist Lofts that was featured in the video that we saw at the top of the hour. Elliot, I'd like to turn to you first to answer a question or two for me. You spent quite a bit of time trying to understand what goes into making adaptive reuse projects actually happen here in California. Generally speaking, you found that the norm is not adaptive reuse, but often much more frequently demolition of the existing commercial structure, followed by new construction of residential. Tell us what you saw as being some of the key commonalities of those housing developments that did move forward that chose to retain the existing structure, and what would need to happen for this to become more common?
Okay, I'll start us off. Thanks, Ben, for those introductions and inviting me to speak today this morning. So in the paper, we discuss 3 major categories to really consider when considering adaptive reuse, which are architectural considerations, land use and entitlements, and economics behind the adaptive reuse project one is about to pursue. So I'll start with the architectural. There's a lot of complications with adapting a pre-existing building that was built for a different use before. And so I talk about in the paper how one of the biggest governing aspects of it is the floor plate configuration. So what that means is with a lot of these commercial buildings, especially built in the 1960s and mid 20th century, they tend to be very deep and therefore doesn't have a lot of exterior exposure that would naturally lend itself to natural ventilation and natural light for the housing units. So the floor plate configuration of the actual building is very important to consider whether this building is set up right for residential uses in the future. Concurrent with that are land use and entitlement considerations. So we've seen so far that a lot of these projects are happening in Los Angeles, and I would argue along with ISI that it has a lot to do with the policy measures that have been taken. Namely that there's the adaptive reuse ordinance that was passed in the city back in 1999 that was pretty pioneering in this field to just expedite a lot of these codes and clarify the applicable building and zoning codes for developers pursuing adaptive reuse in the downtown core, and then eventually the boundaries of it expanded. Santa Ana quickly followed a couple of years later, which is another case study that we dealt with in the paper. And so those types of clarifications as it regards to code mitigates a lot of these risks that a developer would have to undertake in terms of timeline and the complexity of the project. And of course, ultimately the economics also has to support it. Right now, we're seeing a lot of trends still of people coming back into the city core. We're also seeing trends of office spaces becoming maybe less sacred as a single use as people are adapting to working from home. We're also seeing trends in e-commerce, which is putting less pressure on retail markets as well. And so the economic factor, of course, also dictates whether it's feasible as well. And so that's what we've been kind of discovering as we've been looking at California case studies.
Thanks, Elliot. Diana, let me turn to you next. I'd love to get your perspective as someone who's actually living this experience on the ground in a converted commercial building. Can you just share with us a little bit what your thoughts are on how a converted warehouse can sort of help the larger community succeed? And I'd love to hear a little bit about how the experience has been helping you personally as well to achieve your own professional and personal goals.
Well, it works very well for me because I work from home and I needed a live-work space, which this building was specifically designed for, and residents are encouraged to work out of their space. So that's helped me build my business. I think it would be beneficial to someone who maybe worked nearby, maybe wasn't self-employed, but worked nearby and wanted to be able to be walking distance. For instance, I know I have one neighbor who, she is a practicing artist and works out of her live workspace, but she also has a part-time job in the Capitol building, which is just about 4 or 5 blocks away. So she's able to easily walk there to go to work. So I think the location is important and would be useful to people who are looking for a situation like that.
Thanks, Diana. Appreciate your perspective. It's really helpful. Andrew, let me turn to you next and welcome you to the panel. So as a developer and landowner of large commercial properties, I judge you're not often doing adaptive reuse of structures, but I understand you are looking for opportunities to add residential onto the existing commercial parcels. I know zoning was mentioned as a major inhibitor to those kinds of conversions, but what else do you find holding you back from being able to add residential?
Thanks, Ben. So obviously zoning is a huge component to it, but there's even if the state passed a law tomorrow that redid commercial zoning in the state, there's still be a number of obstacles in the way. So Regency Centers primarily owns grocery anchored shopping centers. So imagine your kind of neighborhood shopping center that has a drugstore and a grocer and some other shop space to it. And so those are kind of what's in our portfolio that we've been looking at doing conversions. So one of the unique challenge to commercial property is you might look at a center like something we own that has those components and you'd say, oh, it's one contiguous piece of parcel with one owner. Maybe this restaurant over here, or this portion doesn't do well on this side. That'd be an obvious use to tear down and build residential on. Well, come to find out, lots of those centers often have different owners to them. So a single contiguous piece of property might have one owner that owns the grocery store, one that owns the drugstore, one that owns the shop space, one that owns a fast food pad out front or a gas station. And often those relationships are governed by reciprocal easement agreements, which are kind of a contract that allows you to say, hey, we have rights here and control in certain areas. So you've got to get 5 different owners to agree to go forward on something. And these agreements that govern their behavior are just outdated or never intended for something like that. So that's one obvious barrier that gets in the way. Another one are just the nature of commercial tenants and commercial leases. It's not uncommon for grocery stores, for instance, to have 40-year long leases with an initial 20-year option on that. So if you've got a tenant that's in place, it's hard to either buy them out, or if you want to tear down their building, figure out some way to get them to agree to that. Additionally, even if you're not talking about tearing down an existing tenant, often tenants have what we call control areas in their leases. So even if a grocery, you're not going to tear down their building, but you want to build something maybe on the parking field adjacent or near their structure, the tenant has rights and they can reject and say, no, we won't allow you to do that. Additionally, the commercial tenants often have really large parking demands. Common parking usage is 4 stalls per 1,000 square feet of retail. And so even if you were to tear down or build residential on a parking field, you'd have to figure out a way to replace that existing retail parking. And then another thing we see often is just residential might not be the highest and best use for a conversion. It might be more advantageous to do industrial or hotel or something else. For instance, we own a shopping center in La Jolla in Southern California that we're currently underway on a conversion to add lab space and a hotel to an existing shopping center. Additionally, in the Bay Area, Hilltop Mall in Richmond has been in the news where Amazon's going to be building a distribution facility there. So there's other uses that get considered as well, not just residential and commercial conversions.
Thanks, Tom. Very helpful. Thanks, Andrew. Very helpful. Tom, I wanted to go to you to round us out before we open the panel up. City of Sacramento has been a leader in converting some of its former commercial corridors to housing. But when we saw the data that ISSE presented, the Sacramento region as a whole has not seen a significant share of net new housing coming from its commercial areas. Certainly nowhere near what we see in a place like LA County. What's your take on that? And I guess from your perch as director of the city's community development department, do you think that might look different going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, in Sacramento, the city of Sacramento, we made zoning changes in about 2013 to change apartments from a conditional use in commercial zones to being permitted by right. So we don't have the same track record as other communities that have allowed residential uses by right for a longer period of time. So it takes a while, I think, for the market, for developers to hear about this, and we're not as good as we should be about marketing these changes that we've made. So we're trying to work better on that. I think during the study period of 2014 to 2019, we were entitling numerous apartment projects in commercial zones. So if another study was done for the following 5-year period, I'd expect that we would see quite a few more apartment permits issued in the city of Sacramento. And then finally, market demand and building stock are factors. I think both of those have been touched on by Elliot and Andrew. Until fairly recently, residentially zoned land was available in prime locations in our region. Now that land's getting developed, I think commercial is starting to become more attractive. Also, our stock of small floor plate high-rise offices is not as great as is the case in Los Angeles. So adaptive reuse on that scale is rarer here in Sacramento. We just had an early 20th century high-rise building get converted from office to hotel. And we were hoping that housing would go in, but the economics, the cost of putting all the plumbing work in and making certain code changes, it seemed to pencil better for a hotel than it did for residential use in that particular case. So I think those are some of the factors, but I do see a change happening in our area.
Tom, well, and I'll open this up to everybody, but Tom, maybe you can start us off. I mean, what do you think is the, I guess, trend line look like? And to what extent is this really being fueled by, from where you said, from sort of market, like a market demand versus, sort of coming from folks who either have land or are trying to convert land versus more from policymakers and housing advocates? I mean, how does this come together? I mean, there's both a housing need and there's a commercial opportunity, and I guess how important is how inexorable is this going to be? How important it is for local governments in particular to be stepping in and sorting this all through?
Right. I think we do have market factors that are pushing us in this direction, as obsolete buildings need to be reused and owners need to find ways to reuse them. They're looking to housing as a potential option. In our region, demand for office space, has been relatively flat for quite a long time. And retail, of course, has been going, the way of the dodo. That's not so what do you do with the commercial space? Well, housing would be a logical, choice. We're also, seeing policy imperatives as we look for places to increase the growth potential, to accommodate the growth in our region. Commercial land is often low-hanging fruit because it's a lot easier to say we'll put housing in a commercial area than to say we're going to take an existing residential neighborhood and increase the density or have people tear down their houses and replace them with apartments. So although certainly some of that is happening as well, I think that it's easier to make those kinds of changes. I think it's more acceptable in many cases to the community.
I think, like a lot of problems, there's obviously a market portion of the solution and a public policy portion of it. And I kind of want to highlight one of the conclusions of the paper was that just in municipalities that allowed these commercial to residential conversions, you had double the rate of conversions happening, which I think it really makes it obvious that the public policy of just allowing these conversions to happen in the zoning code is a huge portion of it. And the market is constrained if it can't even begin to make these conversions because of existing policy. So I think it's that would be a huge push of some statewide bill or something that just allows this right in zoning.
I'll add here also on the architecture side that once those policies are in place that clarifies and simplifies these California existing building code as an example, or the zoning code, there's a lot of compelling architectural and marketable reasons to convert as well. So a lot of these commercial spaces that we've seen conversions are things that are now categorized as Class B or lower office spaces that are trying to compete with other Class A's that are coming up. And so these types of buildings tend to have a lot of historic character to them that end up becoming pretty marketable. Commercial spaces also tend to feature higher ceiling spaces, which lend themselves better to live work lofts or artist lofts. And so there are spatial characteristics unique to commercial developments, especially of older building stock, that lend themselves pretty marketable and desirable. And so that might be another thing to consider here as well.
Great. I want to encourage folks to go ahead and put, if they have questions for the panelists, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. I see we have a couple of questions now starting to pop in. So we can go ahead and move to those. But before I do that, to the panelists, I just wanted to mention to you guys, is there anything else that really surprised you in these two Terner reports as you guys read through them, things that you were not expecting to see in either the adaptive reuse study or the zoning study?
I think one of the things that jumped out at me in the zoning study was comparing the conversion rates to the RENA allocations right now, and that if conversions continued at their current pace, it would still take a factor of 25 to reach the RENA allocation. And so I think the secretary put it very well in that this is, one of the tools in the toolboxes. I think housing affordability is a multi-pronged approach, and it's going to take ADUs and Project Home Key and just a number of things. I think commercial conversions is one tool, but it's got to be, one in a number of things that the state is pushing forward.
I think one of the other things that isn't apparent from the study is the market conditions, the things that Andrew talked about and that I alluded to as well. So I think kind of adding some of that intelligence to the data would be helpful in terms of understanding what are the obstacles from a market perspective, from being able to get financing, for being able to deal with tenants, being able to deal with the myriad other issues besides zoning and building codes, or the attractiveness of a particular building, that would get in the way of that we might be able to work on and come up with policy solutions to help address those.
I do see some questions popping up here in the Q&A, so maybe we can just go to answer a few of these together. The first one I see is from Maya Aboud, who asks, are there models of adaptive reuse with affordable housing value capture? Has the Terner Center analyzed the feasibility of those? The answer there is no, we have not. We did not look at the question of financial feasibility, strictly speaking, in this, although certainly we have done some work, and many others have done work looking more broadly at inclusionary housing or local inclusionary ordinances, which would typically apply if you were doing a commercial conversion. And certainly a couple of the bills in the state legislature last year did anticipate embedding that in. So I think there are examples of that. I think the challenge on that tends to be that the market conditions are very variable. And when you're dealing with often very expensive costs to prepare the land or do the demolition, the added economic cost of that affordability can certainly prevent, in some circumstances, the project from being feasible as a whole. I see another question here from Jahns Situ. Maybe I could direct this one to you, Diana. She asks, with so much residential development, some people may want to start a grocery or establish an office. This would lower greenhouse gas emissions and have other benefits. She asks, are there examples of adaptive reuse with commercial development? I think she's asking very much a question about warehouse artist lofts, which if I understand correctly, Diana, does include both housing as well as workspaces for artists to use professionally.
Yes, right. We're encouraged to use our space to work out of. And then it's part of the effort here to invite the public in so that the public participates in some way with what's going on in the spaces. We have a retail portion of the construction where the street level spaces are almost all retail or commercial in one way or another. And after the construction here, I think it was about 3 years ago, a block away, another building, old historic brick building, was converted into a grocery store. So while we don't have groceries right here in our building within easy walking distance, we do.
Thanks, Diana. I have a question from Ron Nahas, who asks about legislation in California setting aside retail CCNRs that prohibit housing if the housing is affordable. Andrew or Tom, are you familiar with this or have any thoughts on that question?
I mean, it's kind of tied into the reciprocal easement agreements that I talked about before. When you have, CCNRs are essentially a contract that governs land use on top of existing, land use policies from a city or municipality. I mean, any kind of easing of rules like that would go a long way in allowing residential conversions. So it's one tool that could be used, but also, I mean, that's one of many things. So I think there's, that could be possible to push stuff along. Something like that were to happen. It's not politically very popular, I think, to often kind of meddle with private contracts between parties, and so I think there's a fine line to walk there. And so something could become of that. Be interesting to see what the state would move forward there.
Yeah, I think one observation, the reason that these contracts and these easements are so important is because of the urban form of suburban shopping centers. Unlike downtowns where every building has access to a public street and where there's on-street public parking, or there may be a public parking garage nearby, these shopping centers are typically designed, if you looked at the parcel layouts, they're quite unusual. And they're designed, so that people can drive through a parking lot and have access to all the different parts of the shopping center, but they're actually driving over multiple parcels. And they don't realize that, of course, but the easements make it legal for them to do so and make sure that no one owner can block access to any other adjacent owner's property for shared access and parking and so forth. So it was designed for a specific urban form and purpose, and repurposing is going to be challenging because it wasn't designed with that 19th century grid pattern that just seems to be so versatile and so easy to reuse buildings in a downtown area as compared to some of these suburban developments.
Maybe just staying on the topic of legislation or policies that are designed to help these conversions happen. There's a question from Ben Vandermeer, which also asks more broadly, kind of what else would, we heard about the benefit of having zoning that allows residential and commercial, or zoning that allows by right residential and commercial. We heard from Elliot about this adaptive reuse ordinance that the city of LA did. We talked about the CCNR issue. Any other specific policies or legislation that you think ought to be on the table that would be helpful here that we haven't talked about yet?
Something we're doing in Sacramento with our general plan update is switching from having a density standard of dwelling units per acre for our commercial areas to focusing on a floor area ratio, which is just changing basically what we're counting. We're not counting the number of units on a piece of land. We're counting the size of the building. And often, a given building size can accommodate more units if smaller units are constructed. And so this shift alone could allow a significantly greater number of housing units to be built, even if we don't allow larger buildings. Now, at the same time, we're also looking at areas where it's appropriate to allow larger buildings near transit and along our major bus routes and so forth.
And maybe we could tie this in as well. I see a question from Amy Anderson, who's also asking what can be done to incentivize residential development over other types of developments, not just to allow it, but how can, what public policy or legislation could help induce more, an owner to make the economic decision to pursue residential over commercial. I don't know, Andrew, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to if you do allow residential conversions, that the density needs to be there in order for projects to pencil. And so if let's say there's a host of things allowed by right in the zoning code. You could build hotel, you could build light industrial, you could build residential. At the end of the day, a savvy owner such as us is going to look at all the options on the table and figure out what is the highest and best use and what gives the biggest return for our shareholders and our investors. And so if residential is not that option, we're probably not going to go forward. But if residential is the zoning is dense, if there's other incentives from the city or municipality to encourage that, then we're going to go forward with it. But at the end of the day, it's kind of an economic decision for owners.
I think one of the challenges that the state is starting to tackle is the development impact fee issue. And so obviously talking about financial incentives, the cost of upgrading infrastructure to support higher intensity development in an area that was planned for, let's say a suburban level of development can be, prohibitive. And so there are state programs at a nascent level to try to help fund water, sewer upgrades and other types of infrastructure that development impact fees typically would pay for. So if the state could fund those types of infrastructure improvements in areas where we want to see this type of conversion happening, then we can lower or eliminate development impact fees for those needs. And I think that would be a financial incentive for developers.
I'll also add that parking is a big determinant. I think in housing circles, there's always a joke which goes like that form follows parking. So if there's easements on that, especially with older downtown core buildings where it's extremely difficult to add any more parking, that would obviously help. And some of the case studies that we've been finding too, often developers find ways to pencil by using a lot of these surface lot parking that used to accommodate a much more intensive parking requirement that residents don't need anymore. And so while the adaptive reuse of the building itself might be an expensive proposition, one can see how they might pencil out by developing the surface lots into further more housing to provide more units and also allow for economic viability of the project.
I see a question from Brian S. who asks if any of us are aware of any cities that have actually done an adaptive reuse of a fully enclosed regional mall. I'm certainly not aware of any, but have any of you come across that? Yeah.
I don't know of an example of a built example in California, but I do know that just in the news recently, the city of Citrus Heights, which is in the suburban portion of Sacramento County, has adopted a specific plan to redevelop their big regional mall, their 100-acre regional mall. And so they're going to attempt it. We'll see how that works over the next number of years.
So there's two I can think of that are large scale conversions. So the West Side Pavilion in Los Angeles was not a residential conversion, but that was an office conversion. That was a large mall on the west side of LA that Google is master leased. And I think it's under construction now. And then in San Francisco, Stonestown Galleria, which is kind of a large mall, a closed mall on the west side of the city. Brookfield Properties owns that, and they're currently doing a large scale kind of mixed use conversion there where they're going to keep the existing mall, but they're building residential, I think somewhere like 5,000 plus units on the existing parking fields that surround the mall, but keeping both elements in their plan.
Interesting. There are a couple of questions popping up here that I want to just have some thought on, which is the question of commercial conversions as they relate to carbon emissions from the construction industry. It's not something that we've talked a lot about here, but it's obviously, particularly with all the climate change agreements going on in the news coming out of Scotland, with COP26. Should this be part of our broader strategy around lowering the carbon footprint of the residential sector by getting more of it to happen within the built form of existing structures?
I think if you can reuse an existing structure, you may be able to avoid the added carbon emissions associated with new materials, particularly new concrete. But then putting aside the construction emissions, the locational emissions, I think, are very beneficial by placing housing in a commercial area where there may be shops and other services that within walking distance of residents means that they can drive less. And typically the commercial corridors are also where the major bus routes and other forms of transit are located. So the ability of these future residents to access public transportation and really make it work for them is greater, I think, in a commercial corridor than in other areas. So those all bode well, I think, for reducing carbon emissions.
I'll just echo what Tom said of there's so much data out there that shows that the denser we build, the closer you can build residential to job centers, into transportation, you make huge strides in lowering the carbon footprint of those residents. So anything we can do to get people in denser housing, closer to jobs, closer to transit makes a huge difference in the state and the world's carbon footprint.
I'll also add that the EPA has been releasing reports talking about how in all sorts of construction and demolition waste that's produced in the country, 90% accounts for demolition. And so the less we can demolish and the more we can reuse, the more environmentally sustainable it is, especially because concrete and the generation of cement, so Portland cement to create concrete, it's a hugely carbon intensive process.
Great. We're actually coming up right towards the end. Diana, maybe I can bring it back to you for a second. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the guests on this in terms of what you think folks should know about adaptive reuse and the opportunities and challenges of living in an adaptive reuse structure?
Oh gosh. It would take a lot of time to share my experience. There's just been a lot of different things come up, and it is a unique residential development here in Sacramento. So being kind of a first time situation, of course, there's going to be just a lot of things that maybe weren't foreseen that now need to be addressed, that kind of thing. It's the second time I've lived in converted spaces, and I had the same experience with the previous place that I lived. So I understand with new projects that it's not going to be ideal or a utopian. Things are going to it's going to be a work in progress. But I personally have really enjoyed and been better informed now about what it takes to make a project like this actually come about. I've lived in California, in Southern California, in coastal California, and in the Bay Area, and in Sacramento over many years. And I've seen how the rental market in particular has been very challenging to keep up with, especially for artists. And oftentimes, just in gatherings, people will talk about, oh, well, see that building over there, they should make that residential, or it should be easier, or why are there so many homeless? And the city isn't doing anything about it. Now that I've heard all the speakers and I have this information in front of me, I have a much greater appreciation for why it's so difficult.
Yeah, perfect. Dan, I think you nailed it. It's just a great way to close us out. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I agree. This is a complicated topic. I do hope this conversation was helpful to those of you who have joined. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat that we didn't have time to get to, so please do stay in touch with us on all this. Reminder to folks in the audience that there is credit available for APA members. I definitely encourage you to sign up for the Terner Center newsletter on our website and to follow us on social media. Thank you so very much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.